Hello, everybody. It's Friday, August the 29th, 2025. We're getting close to the end of the summer. Earlier this summer, actually in late spring, there was a great piece by the Washington Post global economics correspondent, David Lynch. That's David J. Lynch, not the recently departed movie maker. And the title was "Trump May Have Just Ended Globalization as We Know It." Very prescient piece. David's been following this story very closely. His last piece was about what he called the death of Reaganomics, Trump's break with longtime Republican economic doctrine. And he has many pieces on this. And indeed, he has a whole new book out about it. It's called The World's Worst Bet: How the Globalization Gamble Went Wrong and What Would Make It Right. It's out in a couple of weeks, and David is joining us from the offices of the Washington Post. David, congratulations on getting it right. How does it feel to be so prescient?
Well, it's the first time for everything, I suppose. This has been a trend that's been in the making for some time, and certainly what President Trump did back in April and subsequently just puts a fine point on the phenomenon that I discuss in the book. How we got from the optimism and indeed triumphalism of the first years after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s to where we are today with the rise of economic nationalism and a more fractured globe, and certainly a completely different U.S. stance on trade and integration with the global economy. So it's been a long time coming. I think it's perhaps the most significant development in global economics, and that's why I wrote a book about it.
You're not the only person to have written about this. Gary Gerstle was also very prescient. He's been on the show lots of times. His book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, I think is, in a meta sense, a very profound observation of what's happened. Although at the time, David, it seemed as if many people were quite aware of what was happening. I was thinking of Chuck Klosterman's excellent book, The 90s, which was a bestseller at the time. I mean, Klosterman is a cultural analyst and reporter rather than global economics person, but he missed it. Did anyone in the 90s get it? Did anyone understand the bet that was being made? And would it be fair to say that it was made in the 90s? Was there a symbolic moment, maybe Clinton showing up at some casino or other?
Yeah, two good questions. First, I think probably the most prescient expert in the late 90s was an economist who's now at Harvard, Danny Roderick, who wrote a book about globalization. The precise title escapes me at the moment, but it really reads today.
And that's DANI, isn't it?
It is indeed. Yes, he's a Turkish-born economist, very sharp guy, and he was raising a lot of the concerns or questions that ultimately proved to be quite problematic about globalization, particularly in terms of the distributional effects on people, on Americans, and other people in developed economies. Because if you step back and look at the atmosphere at the time, there was a sort of hubris, a euphoria. These were the developments we were seeing at the end of the Cold War and subsequently were things that certainly people my age. I'm 66. I grew up with the Cold War, studied it in graduate school. Nobody at the time, and I'm talking now about the 80s and the 70s, nobody really looked ahead to a day when the Soviet Union would collapse, when the Berlin Wall would just come down. Politicians would rhetorically talk about that, but certainly for most of us, it seemed like those were just enduring features of life. They had been around forever. They'd be around forever. And so when that happened, when the Soviet Union just went poof, and the Berlin Wall came down, and democracy and free markets seemed to be spreading all over the world, You've got at one point in 1989, before Tiananmen Square, you've got an uprising, popular uprising in China that seems to be headed towards democracy. So it was a very heady time. And for several years there, the United States stood alone at the apex of global military and economic power. And it was easy to believe that this was going to be the wave of the future, and that the sort of concerns and problems that we'd had in the past were just going to be a thing of the past. So
Danny Roderick got it. He teaches, I think now he teaches at the Kennedy School at Harvard. But the way you're presenting it and the way we think back in terms of globalization, the end of history, the collapse of communism, the victory of free markets, what I don't really understand from the title of your book is why it was even either considered a bet or actually a bet. You use this word very carefully. This is not a throwaway remark. The subtitle of the book is How the Globalization Gamble Went Wrong and What Would Make It Right. Why, David, was globalization a gamble?
Well, I don't think it was perceived as a gamble at the time. I think it was unappreciated at the time that we were.
So it was a kind of no-brainer at the time, as you know, free markets, the Russians, the Chinese, everyone was in the same game suddenly.
Yeah, and all sort of quote unquote right-thinking people, or most, believed in this idea. To me, the unappreciated gamble, the unappreciated bet that was made at the time was that we in the United States could effectively have all of the good sides of globalization, all of the benefit. And there are, a long list of remarkable benefits. I've benefited from globalization in my own life. As Bill Clinton used to say, globalization's a fact, not a choice. But we made this bet that we could have all the good stuff and not pay too much attention, not really do anything about the costs or the
In other words, David, to put it in rather vulgar terms that America might like, Americans can have their cake and eat it and not even get fat.
Right. That we could have expanded trade liberalization. We could allow the chips to fall on our manufacturing sector.
And they were chips, of course, either potato chips or computer chips. Chips were important in this, weren't they?
But the bigger issue is that, there were going to be winners and losers. And we knew there were going to be winners and losers. But the idea at the time was the winners are going to gain so much that they'll be able to provide for the losers all the assistance that they'll need, not to be left behind, but to become full participants in this new globalized economy. And that never happened. It was all just rhetoric.
So I take your point, but you had a piece recently about the death of Reaganomics. Reaganomics was also about, Trump and investing in Intel and all this state-centric capitalism now that he seems to be pioneering. But Reaganomics was also about trickle-down. There was increasing inequality in America with or without globalization, massively radical tax reform, undermining of the welfare state. So a lot of this was happening in America without globalization, wasn't it?
Yes, but that's not what my book's about. The story I'm trying to tell is, what happened from the mid-90s or so onward, and the way in which we mismanaged or failed to respond adequately to the after effects or spillovers from globalization. And what we just discussed, the winners and losers aspect, is one part of it. Another part is corporations optimizing their supply chains, global supply chains, for efficiency and cost above all other considerations. That turned out to be a bad bet, and there were warnings along the way, even before the pandemic.
So let's get into this. A lot of people, as you've suggested, globalization is a rather technical word for apple pie. It just seems a no-brainer. As you quote Clinton, he said, "Globalization is reality. You just have to accept it." And it's always struck me as just the economic version of apple pie. It may not be perfect if you eat too much of it, but it's still a good thing. First of all, David, define what you mean by globalization, and then go on to explain what's gone wrong, why it hasn't been quite as ideal as we took for granted.
Sure. Well, I think of globalization and the way I discuss it in the book as the easier movement across borders of goods, services, people, ideas, technology, all of that. Um, and why hasn't it? And again, plenty of benefits. This phenomenon over a generation or so has lifted 1.5 billion people, most in the developing world, out of absolutely crushing poverty. That's not a small thing. That's
To put
quite
it mildly, I mean, it's been great for the Chinese. It's been great for India, hasn't it?
It's been great for the Chinese, great for India, but it's also been very good for the United States in a lot of ways. Certainly at the aggregate level, the economy's bigger, we're wealthier on average. But the problem, again, distributional costs. It's been great for college-educated people on the coast. It's not been so great for people with a high school education who work in factories in the hinterlands. So that's been part of it. Supply chains were optimized for a world where everything went right and nothing went wrong. That proved to be a bad idea. Unfettered capital flows across borders have had consequences in the developing world, but also made our economic crisis in 2008 worse than it otherwise would have been. And along the way, I think we were slow, we collectively, but U.S. leadership was slow to respond to what was happening in China and the signs that China was not going to be surrendering its authoritarian political system or its non-market economy, despite the expectations at the time that they joined the WTO.
So it was indeed, at least in your mind, a gamble, which hasn't paid off. You call it the world's worst bet. Explain the consequences of this bet, of this faith in globalization, of free markets, of open borders, of global supply chains. What's gone wrong, David?
Well, I think the political consequences have been seen in developments that put Donald Trump in the White House in 2016 and returned him there last year. So you've got a specific cohort of people, the least skilled, least educated cohort of workers bore the brunt of this transformation. And they were promised assistance by politicians from Bill Clinton on, and the assistance never showed up. As a result, they grew resentful. Many of these same communities and same people were then victimized by the financial crisis, which again had a global element to it. And the political system did not respond to their needs time and time again. And when they were finally presented with a choice, a clear political choice between a representative of the political establishment and the economic system that had been in place for years, Hillary Clinton, or this completely disruptive, unorthodox outsider who was saying things that they believed to be true and promising them help of a sort that they had never received. The first time that sort of clear debate had happened over issues of trade and globalization, they put the disruptive outsider in the White House. And we've been dealing with the consequences ever since.
What do you make of Trump? I mean, I don't want to turn this into another boring Trump conversation, but on the one hand, of course, he has benefited from the resentment, the anger in the American working class. On the other hand, and he's supposedly against globalization, but he has enormously benefited both as a businessman and as a media character, as a personality, as a brand from globalization. He has relationships all over the world, including in Russia. So does the example of Trump speak to the way in which globalization is actually, and anti-globalization is more complex than people both on the left and the right would like to think?
Yeah, I think to some degree that that's true. It's there's not a black or white binary here. Um, but I think Trump's significance and everything you say about the ways in which he's benefited, I should say, is true. And this goes back, even if you look at his experience in the 1980s, when he, as a private businessman, was taking out ads in the newspaper bashing the Japanese, criticizing Reagan's trade policies. At the same time, he was over in Japan trying to find a buyer for his yacht and
right, and a lot of his debt was actually financed by Deutsche Bank. So I mean, he was as smart in manipulate. I mean, he is the ultimate manipulator, but he's as smart as manipulating this new global financial system as anyone.
Yeah, no, his gift though is, and it's remarkable because the people writ large that Donald Trump has as his base are people that he wouldn't cross the street to say hello to in the normal course of business. He lives between Mar-a-Lago and his golf course in New Jersey and his tower in Manhattan. He lived as a private citizen and certainly as president in very rarefied air. And he's not the sort of guy who's going to go to the Cracker Barrel restaurant, but he's nonetheless got a.
Yeah, I don't think you're allowed to say Cracker Barrel anymore, David. I think they changed their name.
Well, no, they've gone. They didn't change the name. They tried to change the logo, but they've gone back to the original after his urging.
Consequences of anti-globalization.
Well, he's got this. Trump's strength is he does have this sort of everyman appeal and everyman charisma. It doesn't work on everyone, but it works on 49% of the country. And that was enough to get him
right. Again, I think we've all had enough of talking about Trump. But my point is that we seem to, I mean, coming back to Bill Clinton, you quoted him. What did he say about globalization?
It's a fact, not a choice.
Right. It's a fact, not a choice. And I don't know when he said that, probably 30 or 40 years ago, but whenever he said it, today, that's even more true. But what seems to be true in parallel are these anti-globalization demagogues of one kind or another, politically, culturally, anti-immigrant activists from Trump in the US to Farage in the UK. So we've got two things going on simultaneously. Globalization is still the reality. I mean, when people go to their local store, they're still buying stuff from that's mostly made in China. In America, that's why everything remains so cheap. And maybe we'll get to tariffs in a minute. But would it be fair to say that Clinton's observation is still ultimately true, David?
Yes, I think there's no question about it. And even as merchandise trade has plateaued as a share of global GDP, services are increasingly moving across borders. So globalization's not done. We're not de-globalizing. Trade patterns are shifting. The next chapter is going to be different than what we've gone through, but there's no question that it's still happening.
So a lot of the arguments against it, and Trump is, above all else, a symbolic politician, are just symbolic. He says stuff to get others angry and to drive his base on tariffs, for example, but it's not fundamentally changing anything. What's your reading, David, of tariffs and its impact on globalization? Is it actually, as you note in your excellent post piece from a few months ago, has he really ended globalization? And just the headline says, as we know it, which is different from globalization itself.
I would push back on your description of this as just symbolic, because what he's done since April does have quite real consequences. The average U.S. tariff rate as we speak is now at its highest level since the 1930s. And it's unusual for an American president to look to that decade for inspiration in developing his economic policies. This is going to have and is having real effects on where stuff comes from coming into the United States and where it goes when it leaves China. And it's a profound development that if he does stay on this course, is going to have quite meaningful consequences.
Is there another interpretation, though, David, that the world's worst bet wasn't really the world's bet, it was America's bet? It was that America could have its cake and eat it, benefit from globalization, but continue to be the unipolar world, the unipolar power, which it had been in the 90s, even before the fall of the wall. It seemed to dominate everything. Russia was an archaic military superpower, but nothing else. And that for everyone else, globalization has been great. For America, it's been less great, more complicated. But that's the nature of great power politics and economics. You always have the rise and fall. Paul Kennedy at Yale, I know you studied at Yale, wrote a famous book about that. It's just the nature of things.
Well, it's the rise and fall of empires does seem to be the nature of things, but there were, nothing's written in stone. In other words, and there are two poles on this debate, and the sort of traditional globalizers will echo your point a little bit in saying, well, this is just the way it worked out. It's not because of trade. It's not because of globalization. There was really no China shock. People are not upset about trade. The Trump phenomenon is all because of racial resentment, immigration, cultural concerns. My point, I don't find that a convincing argument. And my point is there were alternative paths, just like there always are in history, that could have been taken along the way that might have resulted in a different outcome today.
Present one or two of those paths. It's not the Clintonian path, of course. Were there politicians around? And this is a political issue. It would have required someone to certainly be more prescient than Bill Clinton. It was politically smart, though, probably more in the short than the long term. Were there politicians around? You mentioned Danny Roderick at Harvard, who got it, but he isn't a politician. He's an economist.
Yeah.
Give me a couple of alternative paths that didn't take place. What might have happened in the 90s to head off this, what now seems to be a crisis of globalization, or at least of the American version of globalization?
Yeah, counterfactuals are difficult, but I think if you start in the late 90s, from that point on, you've got Bill Clinton and then others recognizing that there are going to be these distributional costs, winners and losers, and that the quote unquote losers are going to need help. But something else was always the priority. So in the late 90s, it was a fetish for balanced budgets and deficit reduction that prevented us from providing new social assistance. In the early 2000s, we've got the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan.
9/11, of course, which changed everything.
Sure. And so, as I look at the alternatives and those, there were alternative proposals that then came up late in the second Bush administration. There was something called the Hamilton Project, started at the Brookings Institution. A senator from Illinois named Barack Obama spoke at their opening event and sketched out some of these issues again, but it was always all talk, and the proposals that were presented along the way, usually from private sector groups of former officials and the like, some were quite would have been reasonably generous, but were always regarded as of secondary consideration relative to what else was happening at the time. And that's part of this story is, it's just like with your personal health. If you've got sort of a minor, what you think's a minor issue, a nagging physical problem, and you feel like, well, I'll get to the doctor next week, next month, and you never do, a minor problem can become a major problem. And I think that's what we saw here.
And to extend that metaphor of health, you had a couple of heart tremors, and then, of course, the next thing you know, you drop down dead from a heart attack, which is basically, I think, what your argument is. We should have gone to the doctor. And it tells us, I think, about how peculiar history is that everybody missed the big story, from Clinton to either of the Bushes. Was it too late by the time Obama, the senator from Illinois, when he came to power? Was it a bit late, or was Obama also, I wouldn't say to blame, that's a strong word, but bound up in this inability to recognize what a bad bet from America's point of view globalization was, and of course, particularly from the Democrat point of view, given the rise, the ultimate rise of the populism of the right.
Yeah, I think again, Obama recognized the challenge, recognized the fact that, as he said at that event I mentioned a moment ago, his constituents were feeling these transition costs and were not getting the assistance they needed from government. He recognized that. But of course, he becomes president amidst the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And so digging out of that hole becomes the priority.
Was that the first, I mean, extending your medical metaphor, David, was that the first, shall we say, heart attack? The economic collapse, the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, was that the first time that it was clear that there was something seriously wrong with all this?
Well, I think it was becoming clear earlier than that, in the first 5-6 years of the century, as it became clear that the reform impetus in China was stalling out, that they were going to remain a non-market economy, that their growth in global manufacturing was even bigger than people had anticipated, and that the effects thus on manufacturing workers in the U.S. Were greater than anticipated. So that was becoming clear. But then it's almost to continue the medical metaphor, and we don't want to belabor it, but that was almost the pre-existing condition for many of these people in many of these communities. Then the financial crisis hits, and now they're really getting hammered again. And still, their perception and the reality, in many cases, is everybody else is getting helped. The banks are getting helped. The corporations, the automakers are getting helped, but the average guy is not getting the help to hang on to his house or to
right.
rebuild.
It was. I'm sure you remember that book by Hedrick Smith about the death of the American dream,
Yeah.
which he wrote in the aftermath of the crisis, when he talked about the impact, for example, on the working class, the people you talk about, the people who now vote for Trump, of that crash, especially in terms of real estate. That seemed to be the eye of the storm of that particular crisis.
Yep, no question about it. And again, these people were, year by year, getting more disaffected about institutions, more disaffected about the political system delivering what they needed. And yet they didn't have, even as late as 2012, in terms of these issues, a sharp enough choice, right? You've got Mitt Romney, who's basically a venture capitalist or private equity guy who represents, the mainstream economic system, and Obama, who initially was seen as a change agent and presents a contrast in a lot of ways with Romney, but you don't have a sharp globalization debate.
You talk about, David, you talk about,
compared to
I'm quoting you here, these people. I mean, quote unquote, these people, they voted for George Wallace in the 60s. They voted for Ross Perot, who was an early anti-globalist in the 90s. So I wonder whether there is maybe a kind of nostalgia amongst from analysts, particularly on the coast, and the idea that, quote unquote, these people, somehow their lives were at one point quite ideal. They've always been, it seems to me, in American politics, rather angry and paranoid, which explains everyone from George Wallace to Richard Nixon, perhaps even in a sense to Reagan, and certainly to Perot.
Well, a lot of these voters also voted for Barack Obama twice. The people, there's a county out in Iowa, I believe it's Howard County, that shows how Obama voters migrated. People who voted for Obama in both 2008 and 2012, nonetheless voted for Trump in 2016. And I think, perhaps you or I would look at that and say, how can somebody go from being a two-time Obama voter and everything he represents, and then pivot to support this guy, Donald Trump, who could not be more different from Barack Obama? And one of Obama's political gurus went out to this county in Iowa, ran focus groups in the wake of the 2016 election to try and figure this out, because this county had been something that Obama had won by 59%, and then Trump comes in and wins it by 56%. Complete flip. And what they found was that people in this community looked at Trump and Obama as two sides of the same coin, that hope and change was sort of the same as make America great, that both were, in the view of the people that were interviewed, both were outsiders, both were not part of the traditional system. And voters were trying to say to Washington, give us change. That's what the message they had been trying to send with Obama twice, didn't get what they felt they'd asked for in many cases, and then even more frustrated, tried to send that message with Donald Trump.
Yeah, and one wonders whether maybe it's not so much the world's worst bet. I mean, in terms of American politics, maybe it was the quality of the opposition put up against Trump, but that's another story. Tell me, David, a little bit about the book. I mentioned Gary Gerstl's The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, which is a more traditionally academic, analytical book. Your book tells the story in a different kind of way of the world's worst bet. You travel around America and you tell the stories of the impact of ordinary people, of how the globalization gamble went wrong. Tell me a little bit about it.
Sure. Well, I try to. This is not an academic book. I do try to examine some of the important substantive questions and debates of the time and try and lay them out as best I can. But I try to tell this story of the transformation of the U.S. and global economies over the last 30 years or so through the eyes of 6 or 7 American characters, individuals. And they range from Bill Clinton and Joe Biden, who are the presidents who bookend this story, to a Silicon Valley investor named Tim Draper, who had been very enthusiastic about China, had made a lot of money there in the early days of.
Yeah, I know Tim quite well. Actually.
Yeah,
he's been on the show.
China's joining the WTO, and then grew extremely disillusioned and stopped investing there. An anti-globalization activist named Lori Wallach, who was a significant figure at the Seattle anti-WTO protest back in 1999, the so-called Battle of Seattle. An average worker at a tire plant out in Northwest Tennessee, who lost his job in part as the result of low-cost Chinese competition flooding into the market. And then 1 or 2 other folks, a supply chain executive at a major corporation who went through the pandemic and subsequently has had to redesign her supply chains. So I think my hope is that by telling these individual stories, it's, frankly, a more interesting way to get a look at some of these issues. And it brings it home in a way that I think the average, lay reader, intelligent lay reader who's curious about these issues could enjoy reading. That if you learn what these people went through, what they thought at the time, what challenges they faced, you will hopefully come away with a better understanding of what we've gone through as a nation.
The subtitle of the book is How the Globalization Gamble Went Wrong, and then in parentheses, and what would make it right. You talk about Tim Draper, who you feature in the book. He's an old friend of the show. I've known Tim for many years. He got involved in politics, I think, on lots of fronts. I know he was a big fan of Reagan. I think at one point he tried to even split up California. Another Californian politician, a real politician, who is now very much in the news is Gavin Newsom. Yesterday, he was at a Politico event in which he talked about Trump's Intel deal to essentially try to nationalize Intel, the Silicon Valley chip maker. Newsom said, "It sickens me to the core." Is there a progressive populist reaction against Trumpism, David, that will get globalization right? Is that what maybe Draper in a weird way, but certainly now Newsom are trying to do?
Yeah, I think the Democrats are struggling with their response to Trump. There's always been parts of the Democratic Party that have been in favor of tariffs and or against most of the trade agreements that we've negotiated over this period of time. But I think Democrats are struggling with just exactly how far to go in opposing Trump's tariffs, and I think they're frankly waiting to see if the economic consequences are as dire or as problematic as many economists expect them to be. So, in other words, if we start to see inflation tick back up to 3.5%, 4%, 4.5%, 5%, if that were to happen, and if it becomes clear to the average voter that that's a consequence of the tariffs, then I think you'll see more courage in the opposition.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that's certainly there's a scarcity of courage. It's like Alice in Wonderland when it comes to the Democratic Party. Are they right, do you think? I mean, do you expect, you're on the front lines of this, David, you're the global economics correspondent for the Washington Post. Is there going to be consequences? It, of course, explains Trump's attempt to take over or politicize the national bank in this country, the Federal Reserve. So what do you expect to happen in the next year or two?
Well, if the tariffs that have now been imposed remain in place, I think it's inevitable you're going to see at least a one-time adjustment upwards in the price level. Now, that's fancy economic speak, I suppose, to distinguish it from inflation, which is sort of a continuing phenomenon. Now, I should say President Trump, one of the things that put him back in office was voters' unhappiness with the inflation they experienced under Joe Biden. And Trump promised that he would bring prices down when he got in. He has not done that. Inflation is rising still above the Fed's 2% annual target for price stability. Putting tariffs on, by definition, makes things more expensive. That's the entire point. The administration likes to pretend that those costs are paid exclusively by foreign countries. That's not the case. The people who pay the tariff to the customs office, who physically make that payment, are the importers of record here in the United States, which are almost always Americans. Now, you can have a debate among economists about how that burden is ultimately shared among the final consumer, the importer, and the foreign producer. But that initial payment is certainly, inarguably, made by the American importer.
In other words, the anti-globalization bet, which is what Trump has made, might rival the globalization bet as a bad bet. Let's end, David, with what would make it right. You claim to know the answer to this. You've got it in the subtitle of your book. What is the suggestion in the book? What can make all this right?
Well, to my way of thinking, both parties have come up with solutions, quote unquote, to the discontent caused by our initial approach to globalization that really speak to problems of the past more than the problems we're going to encounter in the future. So for President Trump, it's been all tariffs all the time. For Joe Biden, it was industrial policy. In both cases, a key part of this is trying to recover manufacturing jobs that we've lost. Most economists, almost all economists, will tell you that's a fool's errand. It's unlikely to be successful at any sort of reasonable cost. To me, the missing piece is, and always has been, more active labor market policies to provide the sort of assistance that people need when they lose their job, whether it's because of trade, automation, artificial intelligence, the transition to a low carbon economy, or any other reason. The help that people need, we should be doing much more policy experimentation, looking at wage insurance, looking at what are called place-based strategies to promote economic development in hard-hit communities. These are things that have been discussed for years. I'm a journalist. I'm not a policy expert, but these and similar ideas have been kicked around for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, there's always been some higher priority. I think what we've gone through over the past decade or two shows us the cost of letting problems and resentments fester past the point of no return. We need to start putting in place guardrails, safety net, whatever metaphor you prefer, so that the next time there's a big upheaval in the labor market, people are not left to fend for themselves, but they can count on some help from the society, from the government.
And is that more likely now, given that this latest wave of technology, of AI, is likely to take the jobs away from the coastal elites, the college-educated people who really still control the country in many ways? So is it more likely, given the people who will most be impacted, the doctors and the lawyers and even the academics and teachers who are going to be put out of work by AI?
Potentially, but I have to say I don't see a lot of action now. It's what I'm talking about is certainly not the sort of thing that I would expect to come out of the current administration. And I think that the budget problems that we're going to be left with for whoever is elected or whoever takes office in 2029 are going to be daunting. They're going to make it hard to do what I'm suggesting. But I do think that the second part of what's necessary is the sort of corporate tax reform to get at profit shifting offshore that has been talked about for 3 administrations now without really making it work. There have been estimates from a very good economist, Brad Setzer, at the Council on Foreign Relations, suggest we could get anywhere from $50 billion a year on up simply by addressing the way pharmaceutical companies assign their profits to offshore subsidiaries. If you could get that kind of money coming in, even some fraction of that kind of money, you could do more of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and ultimately it's probably political, whether it comes from Tim Draper or Gavin Newsom. Someone's going to emerge to offer perhaps a populism from the left and anti-globalization from the left. Interesting and important conversation with David J. Lynch from the Washington Post, his new book, The World's Worst Bet, how the globalization gamble went wrong and what would make it right. Fascinating conversation, David. Congratulations on the book, and love to have you back on the show. This is a story which is the story of our age, and it certainly hasn't finished yet. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.